odious cretins like Antifa, the Folsom Street Fair in San Francisco, children having sex reassignment surgery, dogs having sex reassignment surgery for that matter, bug chasing and gift giving, Miley Cyrus, massive uncontrolled immigration of cultural groups that are totally incompatible. We tell ourselves we are being vibrantly enriched when Rotherham, Orlando, and Cologne happened. What kind of civilization have we inherited? Well, what we are doing is in fact living the end game of Western civilization. This is the end result of the West's unique experiment, an experiment that many think has gone wrong, but in fact is going totally as should be expected. In the next several minutes, I will explain why the transgender, Antifa, children on hormone blockers, and those intentionally trying to contract HIV, the bug chasers, are in fact the true inheritors of Western civilization. The genesis of this video was around a few pints at the local pub with a friend that goes by the moniker The Renegade of Funk. Please find a link to his blog and Twitter in the description. Well, what we were doing was doing as we usually do, talking about a plethora of abstract topics, when he brought up a book called The Troublesome Inheritance, written by Nicholas Wade. So what follows is basically a rehash of that conversation. So the key or foundational understanding that underpins any civilization is that the state is superior to one's own tribe. This applies to the Sumerians, the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Phoenicians, the Carthaginians, the Romans, as well as it does to modern Americans. So going back in time, after the collapse of Rome, Europe was a fractured patchwork of small kingdoms, while the Chinese of the same period had built a government based on meritocracy, at least in its administration, while, for example, the Islamic world wed religion with the state in a theocracy of the caliphate. All societies and all civilizations of the time were de facto dictatorships in one fashion or another, but it was in the West that developed a unique way in which to order its society, the rule of law. That's not to say that the Japanese, Indians, Chinese, or Arabs didn't have law, but the key difference is that the laws were never seen as superior or could countermand the ruling class, in that whoever ruled made the laws and everyone else obeyed. For a modern example of this, look no further than Kim Jong-un of North Korea. But what the West created in terms of the rule of law was revolutionary and superior to even Roman law. The Magna Carta was the starting point of the uniquely Western adaptation known as liberalism, the concept of which is very difficult and hard to pin down, but is best understood by looking at the sum of its parts. It is anti-tribal or anti-in-group, as authority is abstracted away from local family groups. The rule of law takes precedence over, even in theory, the ruling class. The rule of law also applies to all groups, thus in time it eventually becomes secular. And secular law leads to individual rights, as well as, and I might add, undermining religious authority. As liberalism evolved, representative government more often than not became the standard, and in time, as we have seen, that government becomes progressive. When liberalism reaches its apex, it then begins to deconstruct its own traditions and society, intentionally generating new norms and standards. This is where we are today. In Wade's book, he presented clear and convincing evidence that human evolution has been, in his words, copious, regional, and recent. We can observe huge shifts in intelligence, psychology, and behavior in as little as the past 20 generations. Consider the reality of medieval life. It was nasty, brutish, and short. For entertainment, people would gather in the town square to watch grisly torture executions or fill large containers with cats and burn them alive while they enjoyed listening to the screams of the dying animals. People ate with their hands, farted at the dinner table, and wiped their snot with their clothing. Interpersonal violence was also commonplace. Liberalism changed that. In a real sense, it created a more polite and better-mannered society. Murder rates declined as people became less tribal and formed nation-states. Etiquette improved, and the concept of chivalry was born. And it should be noted that despite the pedantic prostrations of the evil that is Christianity, it did help very much in this regard. As people became less tribal, they began to outsource violence to the state, seeing it as a legitimate arbiter of conflicts. The triumph of Parliament over King in England thus led to the Bill of Rights in 1689, which was followed by, quite predictably in hindsight, the American and French Revolutions. Liberalism led to more individual rights, and it led to capitalism. Europe not only began the great exploration of our planet, but also into the nature of reality with the birth of modern science. All of this propelled the Western world to become wealthier and, more importantly, the dominant civilization for the first time globally. There was nowhere that the West did not stand high, and through the same force, liberalism, ideas about the condition of man came into question. The West abolished slavery in its colonies, but it also forced the rest of the world to give up the practice. While slavery still exists, of course, in many parts of the world to this day, mostly in the Middle East and Africa, the West, and only the West, came to see the inherent inhumanity of chattel slavery, as it came to believe in the idea of the dignity of all men. And the key turning point, which, if you look at the progression of liberalism, was the idea of egalitarianism. At first, this would be extended racially, to a point, as well as between the genders, again, to a point. After liberalism destroyed slavery, the next target in the progressive era was women's rights, which led to the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Not so coincidentally, however, once women were enfranchised, the concept of the welfare state was born. And the welfare state is the culmination of marrying individualism with egalitarianism. This is a profound and very anti-in-group secular idea that is, again, uniquely Western. Universal man-made salvation. The expansion of the franchise relates to this idea, as does the enshrinement of democracy as the ultimate political ideal. Liberalism has also led to another very important and in most other societies alien concept, that of the immigrant. An immigrant is distinct from a foreigner. A foreigner goes to another country and lives there as an outsider. An immigrant is seen as having equal standing with the natives, even though having no ties, history, and at times very different worldviews than the dominant in-group. And this is important because despite what vacuous little girls playing house and pretending that the West's concept of immigration is universal and that they can just walk into a non-Western country and be part of that in-group, well, the reality is much different. Societies throughout the world do not have the concept of the immigrant. Rather, they cling to the concept of a foreigner. For non-Western societies that have retained their ethnic tribalism, which is most, the immigrant is still a shaky concept. Ethnic Koreans that have lived in Japan for generations are still considered outsiders. Zainichi is the term that is applied to them. The concept of in-group and out-group is to this day the way most societies operate, from Muslims to Australian Aborigines and all points in between. Immigration was never a concept until, that is, other societies learned the idea from the West. Capitalism as well feeds on immigration. It did do in the 19th century just as it does today. Influxes of Irish and Italians into the U.S. were just as disruptive as Mexicans are today, but both groups assimilated. And while America did change, its core of liberalism persisted. The next step in the evolution of liberalism came after the horror of the First and Second World Wars, which in turn led to civilizational exhaustion and civilizational self-doubt in the West. It was the upending of established thinking with regards to empire that allowed the process of decolonization to go relatively peacefully after the end of the Second World War. No longer was it Europe's burden to civilize the world. The new paradigm was one of rigid egalitarianism for all. It's still the current held belief that all cultures are valid and all cultures are equal, despite observable differences in outcome, prosperity, and human dignity. All thought regarding cultures as being equal was elevated to a sacrosanct fact that only a perceived idiot could dispute. And again, another completely anti-in-group preference that is uniquely Western. And as liberalism continued to evolve, the civil rights movement sought to convince all that there are absolutely no differences between the races, as the sexual revolution sought to convince men that there are no differences between the genders. That's not to say that races are not equal or that one is superior to the other. To the contrary, Inuit, Amazonian tribesmen, European or Thai fishermen each have their strengths and weaknesses, but there are obvious differences in easily quantifiable things such as bone density, muscle mass, and for better or worse, cognitive abilities. The same for gender. Prior to the last few decades, men and women, instead of being at odds with each other as they are now, filled roles that complemented each other, and whether we like it or not, created and maintained families, which is the building block of societies and civilizations, much better than our postmodern sensibilities do. The suppression of in-group preference has led, logically, to mass, uncontrolled immigration of people from completely incompatible cultures, most of whom are not even able to take care of themselves once they arrive. And as they pour into the West, social stability and community cohesion is destroyed. The suppression of observable differences between the genders has also given us the ridiculous Hollywood movies of superhuman women being able to beat down a dozen men twice their size, but also real problems of declining fertility and malignant family laws that discriminate toward men that are at the core of the grievance that many have in the MGTOW movement. As society has become more secular, enriched with vibrant diversity and much less cohesive, standards of personal behavior and even personal appearance are ebbing lower daily. Search the term people of Walmart, which is a very good visual example of where society is at this point in time. This may seem like regression, but it's still in line with the same liberal ideal. Immigration was ramped up in the 1960s while simultaneously the concept of assimilation was destroyed. After that came gay rights, which took less than a generation to go from the Defense of Marriage Act to full legalization in virtually all Western countries. Norms are all but gone now, and in most cases norms are to be socially ridiculed. Kids don't need a mom or dad. Heterosexuality is just one option among many. Sexual relations with animals is a choice. The current normalization of the transgender is almost complete, and thus there will need to be new frontiers in the long march of liberalism, and on it will proceed. At the moment, female genital mutilation, which has arrived incidentally with the flow of culturally incompatible immigration, is something that we're seeing in the news these days. And we're told by the mindless CNN talking heads and their ilk that we, whatever that means, that we in the West universally revile it as it is fundamentally against our values. Wait a decade, and the demographic changes that decade will bring, and see where that argument is. The same talking heads will be calling anyone who disagrees with it in several years as a bigot or a female genital mutilation phobe. Think pedophilia normalization is unthinkable? 2 words: Aisha and Islamophobia. Normalizing anything at this point is a possibility. None of this presentation is to say that people don't deserve to have their rights, but some rights have in part always been surrendered for the good of the community and to keep it cohesive. The problem is, there is no collective community anymore, only atomized groups that mutually revile each other while having to physically exist in the same space. Having no standards, no agreed upon norms or collective values makes any society so unfortunate to be in this position to basically be maladaptive, and this does not bode well for the future. But this is all part of the same intellectual progression that has gone on for centuries. And to preempt the comment section, liberalism is not some Jewish conspiracy invented by Marcuse and the Frankfurt School in the middle of the 20th century, but is in fact much older and has been metastasizing for centuries, as demonstrated in this video. While it is true that the rot has accelerated thanks to the influence of entities like the Frankfurt School, as well as a media and academia that is disproportionately Jewish, it is a shortcut to thinking by simply throwing up your hands and saying, "The Zionists did this." To truly understand the situation the West finds itself in, we need to take a wider look at history. And the bitter pill for many is that it is the non-binary gender fluid, the bug chasers and gift givers, and Antifa that are indeed and in fact the true intellectual heirs of Western civilization that goes all the way back to the Enlightenment. And let that sink in for a minute. Groups like the identitarians in Europe or the white nationalists in North America are trying to get white people to do something that is at odds with their history. Acting tribally. They're trying to turn back hundreds of years of intellectual inheritance and generations of being taught that they, as a group, have no in-group, or, for that matter, any group interests. They're trying to turn back the clock on generations of liberalism and pick some arbitrary cultural point that retains just the right combination of traditional values, capitalism, and civil liberties. They're in for an uphill battle. Liberalism in today's society has become maladaptive. It literally destroys itself as it leads to cultural degeneracy and low fertility that we can see throughout the Western world today. Other groups can and do copy Western innovations, but as they pour into the lands of the West, they are swiftly displacing Western people in their own nations. All the while, liberalism cheers on the destruction of its own civilization, and given the recent election in France, it looks to be almost impossible for Western people to believe they have an in-group. What's needed is a complete paradigm shift if the West is to survive in any recognizable form. It is hard to say how people will react as they become minorities in their own countries across the entire Western world by mid to late century if things don't change. But the answer is simple. For the West to survive, its people have to give up universalism and understand that they do have an in-group, and that group does have interests, just the same as all other groups do. Without that, only an unforeseeable, unprecedented economic, technological, or environmental calamity can hope to reverse the trajectory and the ultimate destruction from within that the West is careening toward. Thanks for watching. If you like this kind of material, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Also subscribe, like, comment, and share. Also remember to check out the Renegade of Funk's blog and follow him on Twitter. Till next time.